So I declare myself the investment banker in charge of Russia, and nobody objects. Now, the only problem with this is that there's no investment banking work in Russia. And so I'm scouring around for about 3 or 4 months until I get my first bite. There is a fishing fleet in Murmansk, which is several hundred miles north of the Arctic Circle, that has put out a tender for investment bankers. And so I go to the library at Salomon Brothers and I discover that 20 years before, Salomon Brothers had done a bunch of fishing deals out of the Japanese office in Tokyo. And so I take all this information and I put it into a proposal and I say, we're the biggest experts on fishing fleets among all investment banks in the world, you should hire us. And I'm not sure if anybody else put a proposal into the fishing fleet in Murmansk because I got a call the next day saying, congratulations, you've won the assignment. The only problem is that they were paying $50,000 for 2 months of investment banking work, which for those of you who know anything about investment bankers, most investment bankers wouldn't get out of bed in the morning for $50,000, let alone for 2 months worth of work. But it was $50,000 greater than zero, and that's what I had earned so far for the firm, and I was a long way towards making 5 times my salary. So I accepted the assignment, and I went to Murmansk. And I get to Murmansk, and I sit down with the general director of this fishing fleet, and he lays out the economic situation. They have 100 ships. Each ship costs $20 million new. So if you do the math, that's $2 billion worth of ships. The fleet was half depreciated, so $1 billion worth of ships at the market value. And the management had hired me to figure out whether they should exercise their right under the privatization program to buy 51% of this fleet for $2.5 million. Again, you don't have to be an investment banker at Salomon Brothers to know the answer to that question. Of course you should. It was a very actually profitable assignment. That's all I needed to do was tell them yes. But having had this experience in Poland of making all this money on this cheap stuff, I thought this is an even bigger opportunity here in Russia. And so the next thing I did was I went to Moscow, and I sat down with a bunch of people in Moscow to see whether this was just the fishing fleet or whether everything else was just as cheap. In Moscow, I discover that there was something called the voucher privatization program. And the voucher privatization program was basically a program where they gave a physical voucher to every person over the age of 18. So they gave 150 million people vouchers. And the vouchers were freely tradable. They were bearer instruments. And they traded for about $20 each. So 150 million vouchers times 20 gets you $3 billion worth of vouchers. And these vouchers were exchangeable for 30% of the share capital of all Russian companies, which meant that the market capitalization of Russia at that time was $10 billion. $10 billion for a country with 10% of the world's oil, 30% of the world's natural gas, 10% of the world's aluminum. I think it traded, I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think it traded at about an 80% discount, the entire country of Russia, to Yahoo. So after my Polish experience, I thought, okay, this is it. This is big. They're giving away free money in Russia. And I went back to Salomon Brothers, and I said, we have to stop wasting our time with this investment banking work and get involved in buying some of this stuff. And people looked at me like I was absolutely out of my mind. I was talking about investing on Mars. And I didn't have very good sort of organizational political skills, and so I figured if one person said no, I should just go to the next person. And what I had done was after going to about 10 people, I had developed this reputation as being this strange, eccentric lunatic talking about investing in Russia. And all the guys who were my age, who used to invite me around for drinks after work or lunch with the young guys, all stopped coming to my desk because they didn't want to be associated with this fellow who was clearly on a career train wreck. And I hadn't been making 5 times my money, 5 times my salary with revenues for the firm. And so I was really in a very bad place, and things were getting worse and worse, and I was very, very frustrated. And I was on the verge of being fired when one day my phone rings in London, and I get a call from a very senior partner in New York who said, I hear you're having some career problems, but you might have something interesting to say about Russia. Could you come to New York and tell me what's going on out there? And so I see this as a possibility for saving my career. And so I stay up 2 nights in a row and I put together a very compelling PowerPoint presentation about how cheap Russia is. And I go to New York and I present this information to this man. And he listens impassively to my presentation for about 15 minutes without giving me any feedback, without even nodding his head. And he abruptly leaves the room as I'm halfway through the presentation, and without giving me any explanation for why he's leaving the room. And I thought to myself, this was my one chance at sort of saving my career, doing what I really wanted to do, at investing in Russia. And I've blown it, and I started trying to figure out what I could say when he returned to the room to make it all better. And I'm just going over and over in my mind how I can salvage this meeting to save my career. And about 15 minutes later, he comes back, and I'm about to blurt out something to get this conversation back on track. But before I could say anything, he said, "Bill, that's the most amazing story I've ever heard." He said, "I want you to stop wasting your time as an investment banker, and I've just gotten a $25 million allocation from the risk committee so you can invest in Russia." An enormous weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I went and invested in Russia, and this was the end of 1993. 7 months later, The Economist magazine wrote an article called "Sale of the Century," went through the numbers I just took you through. And as a result, a bunch of people wanted to buy shares in Russian companies. And as a result, the $25 million portfolio that we had created 7 months earlier had become worth $125 million. And back then, $100 million profit was a lot of money. And I became a sort of local hero on the trading floor, and everybody then wanted to introduce me to their most important clients. And they took me around to meet George Soros and Michael Steinhardt and Julian Robertson and Edmund Safra and John Templeton. And I went around to meet all these guys, and they were taking me around more as a novelty than anything else, just because it was such an interesting story, and all salespeople wanted to have a good reason to sit in front of their clients, particularly these guys. And I was like in my late 20s, and I was having a chance to meet the most important people on Wall Street, so who was I to say no? And so I went on this world tour of famous investors, telling them my story about Russia. And they were a little smarter than all the people at Salomon Brothers at first, because at the end of each meeting, they said, "Bill, that's the most amazing story I've ever heard. Can we give you some money to manage?" And I said, "Well, we're not really managing other people's money, but let me go back and ask my bosses if they're interested in doing this." And the bosses, when I get back to the bosses at the firm, they say, "Yes, that's a fabulous idea. Let's form a task force to study it." And I show up to the first task force meeting, and there's 40 people present. And I don't even recognize about 30 of them. And there was senior managing directors and directors and junior directors, and all the way down to me. And about halfway through the meeting, all of these people then start a big argument among themselves as to who is going to get the economic credit for this business. And as they start to argue, I look around and I think to myself, there's one thing I know for sure, is that I'm not going to get any of that economic credit. And so on the basis of that, I quit the firm, and I decided to set up my own firm called Hermitage to invest in Russia. And I go back to some of these famous guys on Wall Street, and Edmund Safra gives me $25 million to be the anchor investor in my firm, and I get started investing in Russia. I had the most spectacular rise you could ever have in an investment fund. I started in April of 1996, and by the end of 1997, my fund was up 800%. I'd gone from $25 million of assets to more than $1 billion, at a time when $1 billion was a lot of money. So I was up 800%. I was the best performing fund in the world. I was featured on the front page of the business section of the New York Times, Financial Times, Business Week. My clients were sending private jets to take me to their yachts, and I was in my early 30s. Now, if any one of these things was taken by itself, it would be an interesting and great sign of success. If you take them all together, it's the biggest sell signal you'll ever see for anything. A 30-year-old guy with more than $1 billion, up 800%, best performing fund in the world, going to his clients' yachts. Bad sign. And a few months after that, Russia defaulted, devalued, and my fund went from $1 billion to $100 million.